Okay, so the first question, how would you better support carers, including young carers?
Wow, that's a good one to start with, isn't it? I think that it's an area that we need to look at. I'm not actually sure that the states are the right place to support young carers other than through the schools, through the colleges and so on. And I think they can do a lot of work there in terms of supporting youngsters. Other than that, full-time carers who work with elderly people, for example, there's a lot of charitable institutions that help out there. But I think what we could do is allocate some funding for those charities in order that they can support the youngsters or the elderly carers, depending on their own particular set of circumstances.
Fab. That was a minute exactly.
Was it?
So, yeah.
That was quick.
So the second question is, how would you better support our guest workers in Guernsey?
Guest workers?
So kind of people who've come over to work here temporarily, from different places, and just how they're kind of like part of the community. And
okay.
I mean, I don't have much more context to this question, but I guess it's kind of around.
Is it around licensing and that sort of thing?
Yeah, just in terms of like people being able to stay and the conditions they're living in, and
yes.
Sort of the opportunities there are for guest workers here.
Yeah, I mean, I think they've reduced over time, to be fair, because the licensing laws have changed. And I know, for example, that a lot of open market properties took a number of different workers from, let's say, tourism, restaurants, all those sorts of things. And I'm not sure they were necessarily living in the best properties. So what I think the licensing laws did was to change it so that only one person could rent. But of course, that's then prohibitive because the costs can be high. And if you're a seasonal worker, you're not necessarily getting a living wage. You may be getting a reasonable wage, but not enough to make that difference. And of course, the other bit is a lot of hotels supply living accommodation for seasonal workers, but it's not necessarily the best accommodation. And they're often substandard sets of circumstances. So I think we need to have some regulation of the tourism industry and certainly some thoughts about how we can best attract people, particularly, of course, with the COVID-19 situation. It's going to be hit and miss, I think, for a couple of years, depending on whether or not we can attract the tourists.
And to move on to the next question, how would you ensure the island works towards its overseas aid commitments?
Well, at the moment, we don't provide an awful lot for overseas aid. I think we need to look at it in the context of equity and challenge. I do know that you're only, as an individual, allowed to offer up to about £500 at any one time. I think that possibly needs extending because there are a lot of wealthy people over here who would like to donate more. Not entirely convinced, though, that when the money gets to where it's going, that it's used in the right way. So I think we need to do something around governance and regulation in order to make that more effective.
Okay. And next question is, how would you tackle in-work poverty specifically?
That's a difficult one because I know that the threshold for benefits is actually quite high. I mean, it's much better now than it was, it's more improved, but often it takes two workers, for example, to pay rent or pay a mortgage because rents and mortgages are high. And if they've got children as well, then you've also got childcare on top of it, so it's quite an issue. I think we need to look more at tax breaks, some insurance breaks, and certainly helping young people to get on the housing ladder with perhaps some owner-occupied part rental properties that could make a difference. And I'm not sure if that happens over here yet, but it's certainly something we could look at.
Cool. The next question. Do you think that our current levels of economic equality or inequality are acceptable?
Well, no, I don't actually. I think there are a number of workers over here, the nurses, for example, who have gone through a long protracted process with the unions and so on, and they still don't have any parity with other workers in the civil service or public sector. And there's certainly other workers who don't necessarily have an equality of pay experience, and it's certainly something we need to build on and improve.
Okay, so the next question, how would you ensure every islander has access to artistic opportunities?
Wow. I think we could do a lot more by joining up some of the publications for activities. There's a lot of individual leaflets out there and you can happen upon them by happenstance. So I'd like to see some sort of overall publication, a bit like the Metro in London, that we could join all those things together that could be in public places, delivered to islanders, and probably cost effective in the long run because you'd manage it with advertising and so on. And I think that would be particularly helpful.
Thank you. And the next question is, what are your priorities for drug reform in this next term, specifically around illegal drugs?
I think that the question around medicinal cannabis is almost past, in as much as I think most people approve of it. I certainly think that we need to look at not exactly legalising cannabis, but we do need to make sure that it's regulated. I've been in favour of doing something along the lines of alcohol or tobacco, selling it in particular places. I'm not averse to people using it. I'm more worried actually about young people and their access to harder drugs because they're wanting to try something like cannabis. So I think it needs legalising and regulating, but not necessarily decriminalising or just decriminalising, because there are some restorative approaches that I think would be useful for young people so that they don't get a criminal record around it. But there's lots of work to do on lots of different fronts, and I think the first thing that's going to happen is to legalise medicinal cannabis.
And the next question, how would you support nurses to deliver pay parity?
Well, I think it's already in the States. It's part of the policy and review work that's been going on for some time. My understanding from the nurses' hustings was that they were waiting for a further meeting to take place, which has been delayed due to COVID and so on, but that they are hopeful that this will take place very quickly, particularly after the election, and that there will be some resolution to the issues they face, including recruitment, for example, because at the moment there's no chief nurse, and they need to put these positions in place in order to move forward.
And the next question is, do you support bringing Guernsey's parental leave more in line with Jersey's parental leave law?
I think there's not enough time here. I think it's only a certain number of weeks, and certainly only a couple of weeks for the father. So yes, I do support a review of how we operate. However, it's certainly going to be dependent on businesses and what they can afford. Having said that, after the COVID, then lots of parents could work at home, so they may have found that advantageous. And if businesses can support workers at home, then surely one could work at home even with childcare. So I think we need to be more creative, really, rather than legislating on it.
How will you support trans and non-binary islanders, and will you champion these islanders in including them in the anti-discrimination laws?
I'm firmly a believer in equality for all, and I think with that equality comes a respect for everybody and for everybody to treat each other with respect. And I think that comes with responsibility as well, so that you're not particularly focused on being difficult with any person, whether it's race, sexuality, so on and so forth. We've had an incident recently where somebody's been abused on a bus, which is unacceptable. And we ought to have a code of conduct ourselves to say that, yes, everybody has rights. We treat each other with respect, and with that comes responsibility for ourselves and others in the way we treat each other.
What are your priorities for physical and mental health?
I think the states are moving in the right way in terms of the sports initiative. I think that the report recently that young children aren't getting enough exercise is something we need to work on, particularly in schools and with families and so on. And with regard to, sorry, I missed the last part of the question. So something is around sport. The other bit was around
Mental health.
Mental health, yes. Well, my understanding is that there's not enough staff, professional staff, in order to move forward with the mental health strategies that are in place, that there's not enough places for people to go. A lot of it is around working with others, working with families, but I think it's an area that we need to move forward much better.
And the final question is, what measures would you support to move to an economy that measures human and environmental well-being, not just GDP?
I'm fully in favour of it, and I think it's really important in the workplace and in our home lives, because if you haven't got that kind, and it goes back to the rights, respect agenda and the equalities agenda, because if you don't have that feeling of well-being in your workplace and in your home life, then you're not necessarily able to contribute to the economy. So if you can't get out of bed in the morning because you're depressed, and that's because your workplace is not treating you properly, or your home life is very difficult, then it's almost a combined agenda. So if we get one thing right, the other things may slot into place. There's a lot of work that can be done in schools on that front, in colleges on that front, and I think too there's lots of media out there which you can tap into, but it doesn't necessarily always support you. It can actually make you feel worse because you don't match up to the stereotypes that they're providing. So there's a lot of work that can be done, and real work, conversation with humans, for example, rather than sitting on your phone every 5 minutes and tweeting away and so on, which I know I'm guilty of at times, but we ought to take time out for each other and make sure that we're making each other feel good.